I am not pretending to take things in turn, but a critic with a generous memory of the spell of Dumas should not, however, pressed neglect to strain a point for le demi-monde. I doubt my competence, however, to consider that admirable work scientifically. I find myself too condemned to consider it sentimentally. A critic is lost as a critic from the moment his feeling about the worst parts of the matter he investigates fails to differ materially from his feeling about the better. That is an attitude even less enlightened than being unconscious of the blemishes. All the same, it must serve me for the present case. I am perfectly aware that Olivier de Jalin is a man of no true delicacy, in spite of which I take, when I see them, represented the liveliest interest in his proceedings. I am perfectly aware that Madame d'Ange, with her commie infernal, as George Sand calls it, is tainted and tortuous, in spite of which my imagination quite warms to Madame d'Ange. Perhaps I should indeed rather say that this interest and this sympathy have for their object the great total of the play. It is the member of the series in which Dumas first took up the scales in one hand and the sword in the other. And it is a wonderful piece of work, wonderful in kind of maturity for a man of 30. It has all the easy amplitude we call authority. I won't pretend to say what I think here of the author's justice, and if I happen to think ill of it, I won't pretend to care. I see the thing through too many old memories, old echoes, old charms, in the light of the admirable acting of ancient days, of the faded image, of the exquisite disclée, of a dim recollection, even of the prehistoric Rose Chérie, and of Mademoiselle de Laporte. It represents too many of the reasons why I saw him, always ideally triumphant, to practice an art which for its full, its rich effect, depended on interpretation, and to be able to do one's work with an eye on interpretation of that qualities had in common with supreme bliss the element, at any rate, of being attainable only by the elect. It partook of a piece the world cannot give, to be a moralist with the aid of Croizet, a philosopher with the aid of Delaunay, an academician even with the aid of Bartet. Such things suggested an almost equivocal union of virtue and success. One had never seen virtue so agreeable to one's self, nor success so useful to others. One had never seen a play that was a model so alive. In spite of it, models in the theatre were apt to be dead, and vivacities vulgar. One had never above all seen on the stage a picture so conformable to deep pictorial art, a drama so liberally, gradually, scientifically flushed, with its action beautiful in le demi-monde, is the way the subject quietly, steadily, strongly expands from within. It was always the coercive force that his tone gave one the strongest sense of life, and it remains the interesting thing that this element in Dumas abounds, in spite of not being fed from the source that we usually assume to be the richest. It was not fed from the imagination, for his imagination, by no means of the great plastic sort, has left us a comparatively small heritage of typical figures. His characters are all pointed by observation. They are clear notes in the concert, but not one of them has known the little invisible push that, even when shyly and awkwardly administered, makes the puppet, in spite of the string, walk off by himself, and quite cut, if the mood take him that distant relation. His creator, they are always formal with this personage, and thoroughly conscious and proud of him. There is a charm of mystery and poetry and oddity, a glory of unexpectedness, that they consistently lack their life, and that in each case of the whole story, quite the most wonderful part of this is simply the author's own life, his high vitality. His very presence and temperament and voice, they do more for him even than they do for the subject, and he himself is at last, accordingly, the most vivid thing in every situation. He keeps it at arm's length, because he has the instinct of the dramatist and the conscience of the artist, but we feel all the while that his face is bigger than his mask. Nothing about his work is more extraordinary than this manner in which his personality pervades, without spoiling it, the most detached and most impersonal of literary forms. The reasons for such an impunity are, first, that his precautions, the result of a great intelligence, were so effective, and second, that his personality, the result of a great affiliation, was so robust. It may be said that the precautions were not effective if the man himself was what one most enjoyed in the play. The only answer to that can be that I speak merely for myself, and for the fresher sensibility of the happy time. Other admirers found certainly other things. What I found most was a tall figure in muscular motion, and the sense of a character that had made admirably free with life, if it was mainly as an unabashed observer that he had made free, and if the life supplied was much of it uncommonly queer, that never diminished the action of his hard masculinity, and his fine intellectual brutality, there was an easy competence in it all, and a masterful experience, and a kind of vicarious courage in particular. There was a real genius for putting all persons, especially all bad, once very much in their place. Then it was all for another bribe so copious, and so close, so sustained, and so quiet, with such fascinating unities and complex simplicities and natural solutions. It was the breath of the world and the development of an art. All the good, however, that I recollect thinking of Dumas only reminds me how little I desired that my remarks in general should lead me into vain discriminations. There are some, indeed, that are not vain. At least they help us to understand he has a noble strain of force, a fullness of blood, that has permitted him to be tapped without shrinking. We must speak of him in the present tense, as we always speak of the masters. The theatre of his time, wherever it has been serious, has on the ground of general method lived on him. Wherever it has not done so, it has not lived at all. To pretend to be too shocked to profit by him was a way of covering up its levity, but there was no escaping its fate. He was the kind of artistic influence that is as inevitable as a medical specific. You may decline it from black bottle today, you will take it from a green bottle tomorrow. The energy that went forth blooming, as Dumas has come back, grizzled as Ibsen and Wood. Under the latter form, I am sure very freely acknowledge its debt. A critic, whose words meet my eyes, as I write, very justly says, that just as we have the novel before Balzac, and the novel after Balzac, the poetry that preceded Victor Hugo, and the poetry that followed him, so we have the drama before Alexander Dumas, and the drama after him. He has left his strong hand upon it. He remodeled it. As a vehicle he refreshed it. As an art his passion for it was obviously great. But there would be a high injustice to him in not immediately adding that his interest in the material it dealt with, in his subject, his question, his problem, was greater still than this joy of the craftsman. That might well be, but there are celebrated cases in which it has not been. The largest quality in Dumas was his immense concern about life, his sense of human character and human fate, as commanding and controllable things. To do something on their behalf was paramount for him. And what to do in his own case, clear what else, but act upon the conscience as violently as he could, and with the remarkable weapons that Providence had placed within his grasp, and for which he was to show his gratitude by a perfectly intrepid application. These weapons were three: a hard, rare wit, not lambent like a flame, but stiff and straight like an arrow from a crossbow; a perception not less rare of some of the realities of the particular human tendency about which most falsities have clustered; and lastly, that native instinct for the conditions of dramatic presentation, without which any attempt to meet them is a helpless groping. It must always be remembered of him that he was the observer of a special order of things, the moralist of a particular relation, as the umpire of a yacht race is the legislator of a particular sport. His vision and his talent, as I have said, were all for the immediate, for the manners, and the practices he himself was drenched with. He had none of the faculty that sense from afar that wings away and dips beyond the horizon. There are moments when a reader not of his own race feels that he simplifies almost absurdly. There are too many things he didn't after all guess, too many cases he didn't after all provide, for he has a certain odor of bad company that almost imperils his distinction. This was doubtless the deepest of the reasons why among ourselves he flourished so scantly. We felt ourselves to be of a world in which the elements were differently mixed, the proportions differently marked, so that the tables of our law would have to be differently graven. His very earnestness was only a hindrance, might have had more to say to us if he had consented to have less application. This produced the curious dryness, the obtrusive economy of his dram, hammered sharpness of every outline, the metallic ring of every sound. His terrible knowledge suggested a kind of uniform gilt buttons, a feathered hat, and a little official book. It was almost like an eruption of the police. The most general masters are the poets, with all the things they blessedly don't hold for so very certain, and all the things they blessedly and preferably invent. It is true that Dumas was splendid in his way, exactly, because he was not vague his concentration all. Confidence and doctrine and epigram is the explanation of his extraordinary force. That force is his abiding quality. One feels that he was magnificently a man that he stands up high and sees straight and speaks loud. It is his great temperament undiminished by what it lacks that endears him to his admirers. It made him still of the greater race and played well its part in its time so well that one thinks of him finally as perhaps not, when all is said, of the very happiest group, the group of those for whom in the general affection there is yet more to come. He had an immense reverberation, practiced the art that makes up for being the most difficult. By being the most acclaimed, there is no postponed poetic justice. For those who have had everything, he was seconded in a manner that must have made success a double delight. There are indications that the dramatist of the future will be less and less elated. He may well become so if he is to see himself less and less interpreted. The novel in the ring and the book 8. If on such an occasion as Thisvan, with our natural impulse to shake ourselves free of reserve, some sharp choice between the dozen different aspects of one of the most copious of our poets becomes a prime necessity, though remaining at the same time a great difficulty, so in respect to the most voluminous of his works, the admirer is promptly held up, as we have come to call it, finds himself almost baffled by alternatives. The ring and the book is so vast and so essentially Gothic, a structure spreading and soaring and branching at such a rate, covering such ground, putting forth such pinnacles and towers and brave excrescences, planting its transepts and chapels, and porticos its clustered hugeness or inordinate muchness, that with any first approach we but walk vaguely and slowly, rather bewilderedly round and round it, wondering at what point we had best attempt such entrance as will save our steps and light our uncertainty, most enable us to reach our personal chair, our indicated chapel or shrine, when once within, for it is to be granted that to this inner view the likeness of the literary monument to one of the great religious gives way a little, sustains itself less than in the first the affronting mass, unless we simply figure ourselves under the great roof, looking about us through a splendid thickness and dimness of air, an accumulation of spiritual presences or unprofaned mysteries that makes our impression heavily general only and leaves us helpless for reporting on particulars. The particulars for our purpose have thus their identity much rather in certain features of the 20 face either of one or of another of the seth, that the structure turns to the outer day, and that we can, as it were, sit down before and consider at our comparative ease. I say comparative advisedly, for I cling to the dear old tradition that Browning is difficult, which we were all brought up on, and which I think we should, especially on a rich retrospective day like this, with the atmosphere of his great career settling upon us, as much as possible feel it a shock to see break down in too many places at once. Selecting my ground by your kind invitation, for sticking in and planting before you to flourish so far as it shall my little sprig of bay, I have of course tried to measure the quantity of ease with which our material may on that noted spot allow itself to be treated. There are innumerable things in the ring and the book as the comprehensive image I began with makes it needless I should say, and I have been above all appealed to by the possibility that one of these pursued for a while through the labyrinth, but at last overtaken, and then more or less confessing its identity, might have yielded up its best essence as a grateful theme under some fine strong economy of prose treatment. So here you have me talking at once of prose and seeking that connection to help out my case. From far back, from my first reading of these volumes, which took place at the time of their disclosure to the world, when I was a fairly young person, the sense, almost the pang of the novel they might have constituted sprang sharply from them, so that I was to go on through the years almost irreverently, all but quite profanely, if you will, thinking of the great loose and uncontrolled composition, the great heavy-hanging cluster of related but unreconciled parts, as a fiction of the so-called historic type, that is as a suggested study of the manners and conditions from which our own have more or less traceably issued, just tragically spoiled, or as a work of art, in other words, smothered in the producing, to which I hasten to add my consciousness of the scant degree in which such a fresh start from our author's documents, such a reprojection of them wonderful documents, as they can only have been, may claim a critical basis, Conceive me as simply astride of my different fancy, my other dream of the matter which bolted with me, as I have said, at the first alarm. Browning worked in this connection literally upon documents. No page of his long story is more vivid and splendid than that of his find of the book in the litter of a market stall in Florence, and the swoop of practiced perception with which he caught up in it a treasure here was a subject stated to the last ounce of its weight, a living and breathing record of facts pitiful and terrible, a mass of matter bristling with revelations, and yet at the same time wrapped over with layer upon layer of contemporary appreciation, which appreciation in its turn was a part of the wealth to be appreciated. What our great master saw was his situation founded seated therein, positively packed and congested significance, though by just so much as it was charged with meanings and values, were those things undeveloped and unexpressed. They looked up at him even in that first flush, and from their market stall, and said to him in their compressed compass, as with the muffled rumble of a slow-coming earthquake, express us, immortalize us, as well immortalize Yauso, that the terms of the understanding were so far cogent and clear. It was an understanding on their side with the poet. And since that poet had produced men and women, dramatic lyrics, dramatis person and sundry place, we needn't even foist on him Sordillo could but understand in his own way. That way would have had to be quite some other, we fully see, had he been by habit and profession, not just the lyric epic dramatic commentator, the extractor to whatever essential potency and redundancy of the moral of the fable, but the very fabulist himself, the inventor and projector layer down of the postulate and digger of the foundation. I doubt if we have a precedent for this energy of appropriation of a deposit of stated matter, a block of sense, already in position, and requiring not to be shaped and squared and caused any further to solidify, but rather to suffer disintegration, be pulled apart, melted down, hammered by the most characteristic of the poet's processes to powder dust of gold and silver. Let us say he was to apply to it his favorite system, that of looking at his subject from the point of view of a curiosity almost sublime in its freedom, yet almost homely in its method, and of smuggling as many more points of view together into that one as the fancy might take him to smuggle, on a scale on which even he had never before applied it. This with a courage and a confidence that in presence of all the conditions, many of them arduous and arid and thankless even to defiance, we can only pronounce splendid, and of which the issue was to be of a proportioned monstrous magnificence. The one definite forecast for this product would have been that it should figure for its producer as a poem, as if he had simply said, I embark at any rate for the Golden Isles. Everything else was of the pure incalculable, the frank voyage of adventure. To what extent the Golden Isles were in fact to be reached is a matter we needn't pretend, I think, absolutely to determine. Let us feel for ourselves, and as we will about either see our adventurer disembarked, bag and baggage, and in possession plant his flag on the highest eminence within his circle of sea, or on the other hand, but watch him approach and beat back a little tack and turn, and stand off always fairly in sight of land, catching rare glimpses and meeting strange airs, but not quite achieving the final coup that annexes the group. He returns to us under either view, all scented and salted with his measure of contact, and that, for the moment, is enough for us, more than enough for me at any rate, engaged for your beguilement, in this practical relation of snuffing up what he brings, however one puts it, a detailed report, which is but another word for story. And it is with his story, his offered, not his borrowed one, a very different matter that, I am concerned, we are probably most of us so aware of its general content, that if I sum this up, I may do so briefly. The Book of the Florentine Rubbish Heap is the full account, as full accounts were conceived in those days of the trial, before the Roman courts, with inquiries and judgments, by the Tuscan authorities, intermixed of a certain Count Guido Franceschini of Arezzo, decapitated in company with 4 confederates. These latter hanged on February 22, 1698, for the murder of his young wife Pompilia Comparini, and her ostensible parents Pietro and Violante of that ilk. The circumstances leading to this climax were primarily his marriage to Pompilia some years before in Romish, being then, but in her 13th year, under the impression fostered in him by the elder pair that she was their own child, and on this head heiress to moneys settled on them from of old. In the event of their having a child, they had in fact had none, and had in substitution invented, so to speak, Pompilia, the luckless base-born baby of a woman of lamentable character easily induced to part with her for cash, they bring up the hapless creature as their daughter. And as their daughter they marry her in Rome to the middle-aged and impecunious Count Guido, a rapacious and unscrupulous fortune seeker, by whose superior social position, as we say dreadfully decaduto though he be, they are dazzled out of all circumspection. The girl, innocent, ignorant, bewildered, scared, and purely passive, is taken home by her husband to a res, where she is at first attended by Pietro and Violante, and where the direst disappointment await the three Count Guido proves the basest of men and his home a place of terror and of torture, from which at the age of 17, and shortly prior to her giving birth to an heir to the house, such as it is, she is rescued by a pitying witness of her misery, Canon Caponsacchi, a man of the world, and adorning it, yet in holy orders as men of the world in Italy might then be, who clandestinely helps her at peril of both their lives back to Rome, and of whom it is attested that he has had no other relation with her, but this of distinguished and all disinterested friend. In need, the pretended parents have at an early stage thrown up their benighted game, fleeing from the rigor of their dupe's domestic rule, disclosing to him vindictively the part they have played, and the consequent failure of any profit to him through his wife, and leaving him in turn to wreak his spite, which has become infernal, on the wretched Pompilia. He pursues her to Rome on her eventual flight, and overtakes her with her companion just outside the gates. But having by the aid of the local powers retrieved possession of her, he contents himself for the time with procuring her sequestration in a convent, from which, however, she is presently allowed to emerge in view of the near birth of her child. She rejoins Pietro and Violante, devoted to her oddly enough through all their folly and fatuity, and under their roof in a lonely Roman suburb her child comes into the world. Her husband, meanwhile, hearing of her release, gives way afresh to the fury that had not at the climax of his former pursuit taken full effect. He recruits a band of 4 of his young tenants or farm laborers, and makes his way armed like his companions with knives to the door, behind which 3 of the parties to all the done him as he holds then lurk. He pronounces, after knocking and waiting, the name of Caponsacchi, upon which, as the door opens, Violante presents herself. He stabs her to death on the spot with repeated blows. Like her companions, she is off her guard, and he throws himself on each of these with equal murderous effect. Pietro, crying for mercy, falls second beneath him, after which he attacks his wife, whom he literally hacks to death. She survives by a miracle long enough, in spite of all her wounds, to testify, which testimony, as may be imagined, is not the least precious part of the case. Justice is on the whole, though deprecated and delayed, what we call satisfactory. The last word is for the Pope in person, innocent Roman 12 Pignatelli, at whose deliberation lone and supreme on Browning's page we splendidly assist, and Count Guido and his accomplices bloodless as to the act, though these appear to have been meet there discriminated. That is the bundle of facts, accompanied with the bundle of proceedings, legal, ecclesiastical, diplomatic, and other, on the facts that our author of A Summer's Day made prize of, but our general temptation, as I say, out of which springs this question of the other values of character, and affect the other completeness of picture and drama, that the confused whole might have had for uses a distinctly different thing. The difference consists, you see, to begin with, in the very breath of our poets' genius already, and so inordinately at play on them from the first of our knowing them, and it consists in the second place of such an extracted sense of the whole, which becomes after the most extraordinary fashion bigger, by the extraction immeasurably bigger than even the most cumulative weight of the mere crude evidence, that our choice of how to take it all is in a manner determined for us. We can only take it as tremendously interesting not only in itself, but with the great added interest, the dignity and authority and beauty of Browning's general perception of it. We can't not accept this, and little enough on the whole do we want not to. It sees us with its tremendous push, that of its poetic, aesthetic, historic, psychologic shoulder. One scarce knows how to name it, so far on our way, yet all the while we are in presence, not at all of an achieved form, but of a mere preparation for one, though on the hugest scale, so that you see we are no more than decently attentive with our question, which of them, all of the various methods of casting the wondrously mixed metal, is he as he goes preparing well, as he keeps giving and giving in immeasurable plenty. It is in our selection from it all, and our picking it over, that we seek, and to whatever various and unequal effect find our account, he works over his vast material, and we then work him over, though not availing ourselves to this end of a grain, he himself doesn't somehow give us, and there we are. I admit that my faith in my particular contention would be a degree firmer and fonder if there didn't glimmer through our poet's splendid hocus pocus just the hint of one of those flaws that sometimes deform the fair face of a subject, otherwise generally appealing or promising of such a subject in especial as may have been submitted to us, possibly even with the pretension to impose it in too complete a shape the idea, but half hinted when, it is a very good one is apt to contain the germ of happier fruit than the freight of the whole branch waved at us or dropped into our lap. Very often proves this happens when we take over, as the phrase is established data, take them over from existing records and under some involved obligation to take them as they stand. The drawback rests heavily, for instance, on the so-called historic fiction. So beautiful a case it is of a muddlement of term sand, is just one of the eminent reasons why the embarrassed muse of that form pulled up again and again, and the more often the fine intelligence invokes her by the need of a superior harmony, which shall be after all but a superior truth, catches up her flurried skirts and makes her saving dash for some gap in the hedge of romance. Now the flaw on this so intensely expressive face, that of the general Dani of the fate of Pompilia, is that amid the variety of forces at play about her, the unity of the situation isn't by one of those large, straight, ideal gestures on the part of the muse handed to us at a stroke. The question of the whereabouts of the unity of a group of data subject to be wrought together into a thing of art, the question, in other words, of the point at which the various implications of interest, no matter how many, most converge and interfuse, becomes always, by my sense of the affair, quite the first to be answered, for according to the answer shapes and fills itself the very vessel of that beauty exactly of interest, of maximum interest, which is the ultimate extract of any collocation of facts, any picture of life, and the finest aspect of any artistic work. Call novel a picture of life as much as we will call it, according to one of our recent fashions, a slice or even a chunk, even a bloody chunk of life, a rough excision from that substance, as superficially cut and as summarily served as possible. It still fails to escape this exposure to appreciation, or in other words to criticism, that it has had to be selected under some sense for something, and the unity of the exhibition should does meet us, if the work be done at the point at which that sense is most patent, if the slice or the chunk, or whatever we call it, if it isn't done, as we say, and as it so often declines to be, the work itself, of course, isn't likely to be, and there we may dismiss it. The first thing we do is to cast about for some center in our field, seeing that for such a purpose as ours, the subject might very nearly go a-begging with none more definite than the author has provided for it. I find that center in the embracing consciousness of Caponsacchi, which, coming to the rescue of our question of treatment of our search for a point of control, practically saves everything, and shows itself, moreover, the only thing that can save the more we ask of any other part of our picture, that it shall exercise a comprehensive function, the more we see that particular part inadequate. As inadequate even in the extraordinarily magnified range of spirit and reach of intelligence of the atrocious Franceschini, as in the sublime passivity and plasticity of the childish Pompilia, educated to the last point, though she be indeed by suffering, but otherwise so untaught that she can neither read nor write. The magnified state is in this work, still more than elsewhere, the note of the intelligence of any and every faculty of thought imputed by our poet to his creatures. And it takes a great mind, one of the greatest, we may at once say, to make these persons express and confess themselves. To such an effect of intellectual splendor, he resorts primarily to their sense of themselves, and of everything else they know, to exhibit them, and has for this purpose to keep them, and to keep them persistently and inexhaustibly under the fixed lens of his prodigious vision. He this makes out in them boundless treasures of truth, even when it happens to be, as in the case of Count Guido, but a shining wealth of constitutional falsity, of the extent to which he may after this fashion unlimitedly draw upon them. His exposure of Count Guido, which goes on and on, though partly, I admit, by repeating itself, is a wondrous example. It is not too much to say of Pompilia, pierced with 20 wounds, Pompilia, on her deathbed, Pompilia, but 17 years old, and but a fortnight a mother, that she acquires an intellectual splendor just by the fact of the vast covering charity imagination with which her recording our commemorated avenger, never so as in this case, an avenger of the wronged beautiful things in life, hangs over and breathes upon her, we see her come out to him. And the extremely remarkable thing is that we see it on the whole, without doubting that it might just have been nothing could thus be more interesting, however it may at moments, and in places puzzle us, than the impunity on our poets. Part of most of these overstretchings of proportion, these violations of the immediate appearance Browning, is deep down below the immediate, with the first step of his approach he has vaulted over the gate is already far afield, and never so long as we watch him has occasion to fall back, we wonder, for after all the real is his quest, the very ideal of the real most finely mixed with life, which is in the last analysis the ideal, and we know with our dimmer vision no such reality as a Franceschini fighting for his life, fighting for the vindication of his baseness, embodying his squalor with an audacity of wit, an intensity of color, a variety of speculation and illustration that represent well-nigh the maximum play of the human mind. It is in like sort scarce too much to say of the exquisite Pompilia, that on her part intelligence and expression are disengaged to a point at which the angels may well begin to envy her, and all again, without our once wincing so far as our consistently liking to see and hear and believe, is concerned. Caponsacchi regales us, of course, with the rarest fruit of a great character, a great culture, and a great case, but Caponsacchi is acceptedly and naturally needfully, and illustratively splendid. He is the soul of man at its finest, having passed through the smoky fires of life, and emerging clear and high. Greatest of all the spirits exhibited, however, is that of the more than octogenarian Pope, at whose brooding, pondering, solitary vigil, by the end of a hard, grey winter day, in the great bleak waiting, Vaticanin the plain closet, where he does such work we assist, as intimately as at every other step of the case, and on whose grand meditation we heavily hang. But the Pope strikes us at first, though, indeed, perhaps only at first, as too high above the whole connection, functionally and historically, for us to place him within it. Dramatically, our novel faces provisionally the question of dispensing with him as it dispenses with the amazing, bristling, all too indulgently presented Roman advocates on either side of the case, who combine to put together the most formidable monument we possess to Browning's active curiosity, and the liveliest proof of his almost unlimited power to give on his readers' nerves without giving on his own. What remains with us all this time, none the less, is the effect of magnification, the exposure of each of these figures in its degree to that iridescent wash of personality, of temper and faculty, that our author ladles out to them as the copious share of each from his own great reservoir of spiritual health, and which makes us, as I have noted, seek the reason of a perpetual anomaly. Why? Bristling so with references to him rather than with references to each other or to any accompanying set of circumstances, do they still establish more truth and beauty than they sacrifice? Do they still, according to their chance, help to make the ring and the book a great living thing, a great objective mass? I brushed by the answer a moment ago. I think in speaking of the development, Pompilia, of the resource of expression, which brings us round, it seems to me, to the justification of Browning's method to express his inner self. His outward was a different affair, and to express it utterly, even if no matter how, was clearly for his own measure and consciousness of that inner self, to be poetic and the solution of all the deviations and disparities, or speaking critically, monstrosities in the mingled tissue of this work, is the fact that whether or no by such convulsions of soul and sense life got delivered for him, the garment of life which for him was poetry, and poetry alone, got disposed in its due and adequate multitudinous folds, we move with him, but in images and references and vast and far correspondences we eat, but of strange compounds, and drink, but of rare distillations, and very soon after a course of this, we feel ourselves, however much or however little to our advantage, we may on occasion pronounce it, in the world of expression at any cost, that essentially is the world of poetry, which, in the cases known to our experience, where it seems to us to differ from Browning's world, does so, but through this latter's having been by the vigor and violence, the bold familiarity of his grasp and pull at it, moved several degrees nearer us, so to speak, than any other of the same general sort with which we are acquainted, so that intellectually we back away from it, a little back down before it again and again, as we try to get off from a picture or a group or a view which is too much upon us, and thereby out of focus. Browning is upon us, straighter upon us, always somehow than anyone else of his race, and we thus recoil. We push our chair back from the table he so tremendously spreads, just to see a little better what is on it. This makes a relation with him that it is difficult to express, as if he came up against us each time on the same side of the street, and not on the other side across the way, where we mostly see the poets elegantly walk, and where we greet them without danger of concussion. It is on this same side, as I call it on our side on the other hand, that I rather see our encounter with the novelists taking place, we being, as it were, more mixed with them, or they at least by their desire and necessity more mixed with us, and our brush of them in their minor frenzy, a comparatively muffled encounter. We have in the whole thing, at any rate, the element of action, which is at the same time constant picture, and the element of picture, which is at the same time constant action, and with a fusion, as the mass moves, that is none the less effective, none the less thick, and complete from our not owing it in the least to an artful economy. Another force pushes its way through the waste and rules the scene, making wrong things right and right things 100 times more. That breath of Browning's own particular matchless Italy, which takes us full in the face, and remains from the first the felt rich colored air in which we live. The quantity of that atmosphere that he had to give out is like nothing else in English poetry any more than in English prose that I recall. And since I am taking these liberties with him, let me take one too, a little, with the fruit of another genius shining at us here in association with that great placed and timed prose fiction which we owe to George Eliot, and in which her projection of the stage and scenery is so different a matter. Curious enough, this difference, where so many things make for identitithe quantity of talent, the quantity of knowledge, the high equality, or almost of culture and curiosity, not to say of spiritual life, each writer drags along a far-sweeping train, though indeed Browning's spreads so considerably furthest, but his stirs up to my vision a perfect cloud of gold dust, while hers in Romola, by contrast, leaves the air about as clear, about as white, and withal, about as cold as before she had benevolently entered it. This straight saturation of our authors, this prime assimilation of the elements, for which the name of Italy stands, is a single splendid case. However, I can think of no second one that is not below it if we take it as supremely expressed in those of his lyrics and shorter dramatic monologues that it has most helped to inspire. The Rome and Tuscany of the early 50s had become for him so at once a medium, a bath of the senses and perceptions, into which he could sink, in which he could unlimitedly soak, that wherever he might be touched afterwards, he gave out some effect of that immersion. This places him to my mind quite apart, makes the rest of our poetic record of a similar experience comparatively pale and abstract. Shelley and Swinburne name only his compeers I know a part of the record, but the author of Men and Women of Pippa passes of certain of the dramatic lyrics and other scattered felicities, not only expresses and reflects the matter, he heatedly, if I may use such a term, exudes and perspires it. Shelley, let us say, in the connection is a light, and Swinburne, let us say, a sound. Browning alone of them all is a temperature. We feel it. We are in it at a plunge, with the very first pages of the thing before us, to which, I confess, we surrender with a momentum drawn from 50 of their predecessors, pages not less sovereign elsewhere. The old Florence of the late spring closes round us. The hand of Italy is at once with the recital of the old-world litter of Piazza San Lorenzo, with that of the great glare, and of the great shadow masses heavy upon us, heavy with that strange weight, that mixed pressure, which is somehow to the imagination at once a caress and a menace. Our poet kicks up on the spot, and at short notice, what I have called his cloud of gold dust. I can but speak for myself, at least something that I want to feel both as historic and aesthetic truth, both as pictorial and moral interest, something that will repay my fancy tenfold, if I can but feel it hovers before me, and I say to myself that whether or no a great poem is to come off, I will be hanged if one of the vividest of all stories and one of the sharpest of all impressions doesn't I beckon these things on. I follow them up. I so desire and need them that I, of course, by my imaginative collaboration, contribute to them from the moment, that is, of my finding myself really in relation to the great points. On the other hand, as certainly it has taken the author of the first volume and of the two admirable chapters of the same sense, I can't call them cantos entitled respectively Half Rome and the other Half Rome to put me in relation where it is that he keeps me more and more letting the closeness of my state, it must be owned occasionally drop, letting the finer call on me, even for bad quarters of an hour considerably languish, but starting up before me again in vivid authority, if I really presume to droop or stray, he takes his willful way with me. But I make it my own, picking over and over, as I have said, like some lingering talking peddlers. Client his great unloosed pack, and thus it is that by the time I am settled with Pompilia at Arezzo, I have lived into all the conditions they press upon me, close those wonderful, dreadful, beautiful particulars of the Italy of the eve of the 18th century, Browning himself, moving about, darting hither and thither in them, at his mighty ease, beautiful, I say, because of the quantity of romantic and aesthetic tradition. From a more romantic and aesthetic age, still visibly palpably in solution there, and wonderful and dreadful, through something of a similar tissue of matchless and ruthless consistencies and immoralities, I make to my hand, as this infatuated reader, my Italy of the eve of the 18th century, a vast painted and gilded rococo shell, roofing over a scenic and amazingly figured and furnished earth, but shutting out almost the whole of our own dearly bought, rudely recovered spiritual sky. You see, I have this right all the while if I recognize my suggested material, which keeps coming and coming in the measure of my need, and my duty to which is to recognize it. And as handsomely and actively as possible, the great thing is that I have such a group of figures moving across, so constituted a scene of figures, so typical, so salient, so reeking with the old-world character, so impressed all over with its manners and its morals, and so predestined, we see, to this particular horrid little drama. And let me not be charged with giving it away the idea of the latent prose fiction. By calling it little and horrid, let me not for with my contention, I can't possibly afford topia to agree with those who speak of the Franceschini Comparini case as a mere vulgar criminal anecdote. It might have been such, but for two reasons, counting only the principal ones. One of these are fact, that we see it, so I repeat, in Browning's inordinately colored light, and the other, which is indeed perhaps but another face of the Samathat, with whatever limitations, it gives us in the rarest manner three characters of the first importance. I hold three, a great many I could have done with it, almost I think, if there had been but 1 or 2 hour. Rich provision shows you at any rate what I mean by speaking of our author's performance, as above all a preparation for something deeply. He felt that with the three built up at us each, with an equal genial rage of reiterative touches, there couldn't eventually not be something done, artistically done, I mean, if someone would only do it. There they are in their old yellow Arezzo, that miniature milder Florence, as sleepy to my recollection as a little English cathedral city clustered about a close, but dreaming not so peacefully nor so innocently. There is the great fretted fabric of the church, on which they are all swarming and groveling, yet after their fashion interesting parasites from the high and dry old archbishop, meanly wise, or ignobly edifying, to whom Pompilia resorts in her woe, and who practically pushes her way with a shuffling velvet foot down through the couple of Franceschini cadets, Canon Girolamo and Abate Paul, mere minions, fairly in the verminous degree of the overgrown order or Taurank organism, down to Count Guido himself, and to Canon Caponsacchi, who have taken the tonsure at the outset of their careers, but none too strictly the vows, and who lead their lives under some strangest, profanest, pervertedest clerical category. There have been before this the Roman preliminaries, the career of the queer Comparini, the adoption, the assumption of the parentship of the ill-starred little girl, with the sordid cynicism of her marriage out of hand, conveying her presumptive little fortune, her poor handful of even less than contingent cash, to hungry middle-aged Count Guido's stale, rank, the Maniton note or turbid harmony of all of which recurs to us in the vivid image of the pieties and paganisms of San Lorenzo in Lucina, that banal little church in the old Upper Corsabonal that is at the worst, with the rare Roman banalite, bravely banal or banal, with Stylistically, we have all passed with a sense of its reprieve to our sightseeing, and where the bleeding bodies of the still-breathing Pompilia and her extinct companions are laid out on the greasy marble of the altar steps. To glance at these things, however, is fairly to be tangled, and at once in the author's complexity of suggestion, to which our own thick-coming fancies respond in no less a measure, so that I have already missed my time to so much even as name properly the tremendous little chapter we should have devoted to the Franceschini interior, as revealed at last to Camperini eyes the sinister scene or ragged ruin of the Aretine palace, where pride and penury, and at once rabid resentment, show their teeth in the dark and the void, and where Pompilia's inspired little character, clear silver, hardened, effectually beaten, and battered to steel, begins to shine at the blackness, with a light that fairly outfaces at last the gleam of wolfish-fanged character that draws from Guido in his, alas, too boundless harangue of the 4th volume, some of the sharpest specifications into which that extraordinary desert, that indescribable waste of intellectual life, as I have hinted at its being from time to time, flowers. None of your abnegation of revenge. Fly at me, frank tug, where I tear again. Away with the empty stare, be wholly still. And stupid, ever occupy your patch of private snow that somewhere in what world may now be growing icy round your head. An aguish at your footprint freeze, not me. I have spoken of the enveloping consciousness, or call it just the struggling emerging, comparing at last intensely living conscientia of Caponsacchi as the indicated center of our situation or determinant of our form in the matter of the excellent novel, and know, of course, what such an indication lets me in for, responsibly speaking, in the way of a rearrangement of relations, in the way of liberties taken to lift our subject out of the sphere of anecdote and place it in the sphere of drama, liberally considered to give it dignity, by extracting its finest importance, causing its parts to flower together into some splendid special sense. We supply it with a large lucid reflector, which we find only, as I have already noted, in that mind and soul concerned in the business that have at once the highest sensibility and the highest capacity, or that are, as we may call it, most admirably agitated. There is the awkward fact, the objector may say, that by our record the mind and soul in question are not concerned, till a given hour when many things have already happened, and the climax is almost in sight, to which we reply at our ease, that we simply don't suffer that fact to be awkward from the moment. I am taking liberties, I suffer no awkwardness, I should be very helpless, quite without resource, and without vision, if I Roman 999, I said it to begin with. Browning works the whole thing over the whole thing as originally given him, and we work him helpfully, artfully, boldly, which is our whole blessed basis. We therefore turn Caponsacchi on earlier, ever so much earlier, turn him on, with a brave ingenuity from the very first, that is in Rome, if need be, place him there in the field, at once recipient and agent, vaguely conscious and with splendid brooding apprehension, awaiting the adventure of his life, awaiting his call, his real call. The others have been such vain shows and hollow stopgaps, awaiting, in fine, his terrible great fortune. His direct connection with Pompilia begins certainly at Arezzo, only after she has been some time hideously mismated, and has suffered all but her direst extremity. That is of the essence. We take it, it's all right, but his indirect participation is another affair, and we get it at a magnificent stroke. The fact that his view of Franceschini, his fellow Aretine, sordidly on the make, his measure of undesired, indeed of quite execrated contact with him, brushed against, in the motley hungry Roman traffic, where, and while that sinister soul snuffs about on the very vague or the very foul scent of his fortune, may begin whenever we like. We have only to have it begin right, only to make it, on the part of two men, a relation of strong irritated perception and restless righteous convinced instinct in the one nature, and of equally instinctive hate and envy, jealousy and latent fear on the other, to see the indirect connection, the one with Pompilia, as I say, throw across our page as portentous a shadow as we need. Then we get Caponsacchi as a recipient up to the bremas, an agent, a predestined one up to the hilt. I can scarce begin to tell you what I see him give, as we say, or how his sentient and observational life, his fine reactions, in presence of such a creature as Guido, such a social type, an image and lurid light, as it were, make him, comparatively, a modern man breathed upon to that deep and interesting agitation I have mentioned by more forces than he yet reckons or knows the names of. The direct relational ways to Pompilia's made at Arezzo, as we know by Franceschini himself, preparing his own doom in the false light of his debased wit, by creating an appearance of hidden dealing between his wife and the priest, which shall as promptly as he likes, if he but work it right, compromise and overwhelm them. The particular deepest damnation he conceives for his weakest victim is that she shall take the cleric Caponsacchi for her lover. He indubitably will into Guido's apprehension, and that her castigation at his hands for this sufficiently proved upon her, shall be the last luxury of his own baseness. He forges infernally, though grossly enough, an imputed correspondence between them, as series of love letters, scandalous scrawls of the last erotic intensity, which we in the event see solemnly weighed by his fatuous judges, all fatuous. Save the grave old Pope in the scale of Pompilia's guilt and responsibility, it is this atrocity that at the denouement damns Guido himself most or wellnigh. But if it fails and recoils, as all his calculations doit, is only his rush of passion that doesn't miss thighs, is by the fact exactly that as we have seen his wife and her friend are for our perfect persuasion characters of the deepest dye there, if you please, is the finest side of our subject. Such sides come up, such sides flare out upon us. When we get such characters in such embroilments, admire with me, therefore, our felicity in this first-class value of Browning's beautiful critical genial vision of his Capensac vision of him, as the tried and tempered and illuminated man, a great round smooth though as yet but little worn gold piece, an embossed and figured ducat or sequin of the period, placed by the poet in my hand, he gives me that value to spend for him, spend on all the strange old experience, old sights and sounds and stuffs of the old stored Italisso. We have at least the wit to spend it to high advantage, which is just what I mean by our taking the liberties we spoke of. I see such bits we can get with it. But the difficulty is that I see so many more things than I can have even dreamed of giving you a hint of. I see the Arezzo life and the Arezzo crisis with every eye dotted and every circumstance presented, and when Guido takes his wife as a possible trap for her to the theatre of old Arezzo, share with me the tattered vision, and inhale the musty air. I am well in range of Pompilia, the tragically exquisite in her box, with her husband not there for the hour, but posted elsewhere. I look at her, in fact, over Capensac's shoulder, and that of his brother Canon Conti, while this light character, a vivid recruit to our company, manages to toss into her lap, and as coming in guise of overture from his smitten friend, a paper twist of comforts. There is a particular famous occasion at the theatre, in a work of more or less contemporary fiction at a petty provincial theatre, which isn't even, as you might think, the place where Pendennis had his first glimpse of Miss Fotheringay. The evening at the Rouen Playhouse of Flaubert's Madame Bovary has a relief not elsewhere equal. It is the most done visit to the play in all literature, but though doing is now so woefully out of favor, my idea would be to give it here a precious pendant, which connection silly Canon Conti, the old fripperies and levities, the whole queer picture and show of manners, is handed over to us expressly as inapt for poetic illustration. What is equally apt for poetic, or for the other indeed, is the thing for which we feel the ring, and the book preponderantly donate, is at least what comes out clearest, comes out as straightest and strongest and finest from Browning's genius, exhibition of the great constringent relation between man and woman at once at its maximum, and as the relation most worth-while in life for either party, an exhibition forming quite the main substance of our author's message. He has dealt in his immense variety and vivacity with other relations, but on this he has thrown his most living weight. It remains the thing of which his own rich experience most convincingly spoke to him. He has testified to it as charged to the brim with the burden of the senses, and has testified to it as almost too clarified, too liberated, and sublimated for traceable application or fair record. He has figured it as never too much either of the flesh or of the spirit for him, so long as the possibility of both of these is in each, but always and ever as the thing absolutely most worth, while it is in the highest and rarest degree clarified and disengaged for Caponsacchi and Pompilia. But what their history most concludes to is how ineffably it was whatever happened worth while most then for them, or for us, is the question. Well, let us say worth while assuredly for us in this noble exercise of our imagination, which accordingly shows us what we for all our prose basis would have found, to repeat my term once more, prepared for us. There isn't a detail of their panting flight to Rome over the autumn Apennines, long hours when they melt together only not to meet, that doesn't positively plead for our perfect prose transcript. And if it be said that the mere massacre at the final end is a lapse to passivity from the high plane for our pair of protagonists of constructive, of heroic vision, this is not a blur from the time everything that happens most effectively to Caponsacchi's life. Pompilia's is taken, but she is none the less given, and it is in his consciousness and experience that she most intensely flowers, with all her jubilation for doing so, so that he contains the whole unless, indeed, after all the Pope does the Pope, whom I was leaving out as too transcendent for our version, and less and less. Further and further, I see what I have at this late moment no right to see as the very end and splendid climax of all Caponsacchi sent for to the Vatican, and admitted alone to the papal presence. There is a scene, if we will, and in the mere mutual confrontation, brief, silent, searching, recognizing, consecrating, almost as august on the one part, as on the other it rounds us off. But you will think I stray too far. I have wanted, alas, to say such still other fond fine. Thinks it being of our poets' great nature to prompt them at every step that I almost feel I have missed half my points, which will doubtless therefore show you these remarks in their nakedness. Take them, and my particular contention as a pretext, and a minor affair, if you will only feel them at the same time, as at the worst a restless refinement of homage. It has been easy in many another case to run to earth the stray prime fancy, the original anecdote, artless tale from which a great imaginative work, starting off, after meeting, it has sprung and rebounded again, and soared, and perhaps it is right and happy and final that one should have faltered in attempting by a converse curiosity to clip off or tie back the wings that once have spread. You will agree with me none the less I feel that Browning's great generous wings are over us still, and even now more than ever now, and also that they shake down on us his blessing. Address delivered before the Academic Committee of the Royal Society of Literature in commemoration of the centenary of Robert Browning, May 7, 1912. An American Archalla, Charles Eliot Norton. I gladly embrace the occasion to devote a few words to the honored memory of my distinguished friend, the late Charles Eliot Norton, who, dying at Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the 21st of October last, after having reached his 80th year, had long occupied and, with an originality of spirit and a beneficence of effect, all his own chair of the history of the fine arts at Harvard University, as well as in the view of the American world surrounding that seat of influence, the position of one of the most accomplished of scholars and most efficient of citizens. This commemorative page may not disclaim the personal tone, for I can speak of Charles Norton, but in the light of an affection which began long years ago, even though my part in our relation had to be for some time markedly that of a junior, of which tie I was to remain ever, after despite long stretches of material separation, a conscious and grateful beneficiary. I can speak of him, therefore, as I happen myself to see and know him with interest and sympathy, acting for considerable periods together across distances and superficial differences, yet with the sense of his extremely individual character and career suffering no abatement, and indeed, with my impression of the fine consistency and exemplary value of these things clear as never before. I find this impression go back for its origin very far to one autumn day, when an extremely immature aspirant to the rare laurel of the critic, I went out from Boston to Cambridge to offer him a contribution to the old, if I should not rather say, the then middle-aged North American Review, of which he had recently undertaken the editorship. I already knew him a little enough to have met casual kindness at his hands, but my vision of his active presence and function in the community that had happily produced, and that was long to enjoy him, found itself, I think, completely constituted at that hour, with scarce an essential touch, to be afterwards added. He largely developed and expanded as time went on. Certain more or less local reserves and conservatisms fell away from him, but his temper and attitude, all his own from the first, were to give a singular unity to his life. This intensity of perception on his young visitor's part may perhaps have sprung a little from the fact that he accepted on the spot, as the visitor still romantically remembers, a certain very first awkward essay in criticism, and was to publish it in his forthcoming number. But I little doubt whether, even had he refused it, the grace of the whole occasion would have lost anything to my excited view, and feel sure that the interest in particular would have gained had he charmingly put before me, as he would have been sure to do, the ground of his discrimination for his eminent character as a representative of culture, announced itself exactly in proportion as one's general sense of the medium in which it was to be exerted was strong, and I seem verily to recall that even in the comparative tenderness of that season I had grasped the idea of the precious, the quite far-reaching part such an exemplar might play. Charles Norton's distinction and valuethes was still some years before his professorate had taken form, showed early and above all the note and the advantage that they were to be virtues of American application and were to draw their life from the signal American opportunity to that degree that the detailed record of his influence would be really one of the most interesting of American social documents, and that his good work is best lighted by a due acquaintance with the conditions of the life about him indispensable for founded recognition of it. It is not too much to say that the representative of culture railways in the high and special sense in which he practiced that faith had before him in the United States of those days, a great and arduous mission requiring plentiful courage, as well as plentiful knowledge, endless good humor, as well as assured taste. What comes back to me, then, from the early day I have glanced at is exactly that prompt sense of the clustered evidence of my friend's perfect adaptation to the civilizing mission, and not least to the needfully dauntless and unperturbed side of it, his so pleasant old hereditary home with its ample acres and numerous spoilset, a time when acres merely marginal, and so to speak atmospheric as well as spoils at all felicitously gathered, were rare in the United States, seemed to minister to the general assurance constituting, as they did, such a picture of life as one vaguely supposed recognizable right and left in an old society or otherwise expressed in that Europe which was always roundabout one the fond alternative of the cultivated imagination, but of which the possible American copy ever seemed far to seek to put it in a nutshell. The pilgrimage to the shady hill of those years had among the spoils, among pictures and books, drawings and medals, memories and relics, and anecdotes, things of a remote but charming reference, very much the effect of a sudden rise into a finer and clearer air, and of a stopgap against one's own coveted renewal of the more direct experience, if I allude to a personal yearning appreciation of those matters. It is with the justified conviction, this justification having been all along abundantly perceptible, that appreciation of the general sort only waited to be called for, though to be called for with due authority, it was the sign of our host on the attaching spot, and almost the principal one, that he spoke all round, and with the highest emphasis, as under the warrant of authority, and that at a time when as to the main matter of his claim and his discourse scarce anyone pretended to it, he carried himself valiantly under that banner. The main matter of his discourse offered itself just simply as the matter of civilization, the particular civilization that a young, roaring, and money-getting democracy inevitably, but almost exclusively occupied with business success, most needed to have brought home to it. The New England air in especial was no natural conductor of any appeal to an aesthetic aim, but the interest of Professor Norton's general work, to say nothing of the interest of his character for a closer view, is exactly that the whole fruitful enterprise was to prove intimately a New England adventure, illustrating thus, at the same time, and once more, the innate capacity of New England for leavening the great American mass on the finer issues. To have grown up as the accomplished man at large was in itself at that time to have felt, and even in some degree to have suffered, this hand of differentiation. The only accomplished men of the exhibited New England society had been the ministers, the heads of the congregations, whom, however, one docks of little of their credit in saying that their accomplishments and their earnestness had been almost wholly in the moral, or to the advantage of that connection, was indeed what Norton was fundamentally to have enjoyed in his descent, both on his father's and his mother's side, preeminently on the latter, the historic stock of the Eliots, from a long line of those stalwart pastoral worthies who had notably formed the aristocracy of Massachusetts. It was largely, no doubt, to this heritage of character and conscience that he owed the strong and special strain of confidence with which he addressed himself to the business of perfect candor toward his fellow citizens' pupils. In particular, they to whom this candor was to become in the long run the rarest and raciest and most endearing of treats, being but his fellow citizens. In the making, this view of an urgent duty would have been a comparatively slight thing. Moreover, without the special preoccupations, without the love of the high humanities and curiosities and urbanities in themselves, without the conception of science, and the ingrained studious cast of mind, which had been also an affair of heredity with him, and had opened his eyes betimes to educative values and standards other than most of those he saw flourish near at hand, he would defer to dilettantism as little as to vulgarity. And if he ultimately embraced the fine ideal of taking up the work that lay close to him at home, and of irrigating the immediate arid tracts and desert spaces. It was not from ignorance of the temptation to wander and linger where the streams already flowed, and the soil had already borne an abiding fruit. He had come to Italy and to England early in life. He had repeated his visits to these countries with infinite relish, and as often as possible, though never as a good New Englander without certain firm, and where they had to be invidious discriminations, he was attached to them by 100 intellectual and social ties. But he had been from the first incapable of doubting that the best activity and the liveliest interest lay where it always given certain conditions lies in American, a measure of response to intellectual and aesthetic missionary labor, more traceable and appreciable, more distinguishably attested, and registered more directly and artlessly grateful in a word, than in the thicker elemental mixture of Europe. On the whole side of taste and association his choice was thus betimes for conscious exile, and for a considerably, though doubtless not altogether irremediably deprived state, but it was at the same time for a freedom of exhortation, and a play of ironic comment, less restricted after all in the clear American air than on ground, more pretentiously and closeless restricted, that is, from the moment personal conviction might be absolute and indifference to every form of provincial bewilderment equally patient, and complete the incontestable crannery of his attitude a thing that one felt to be a high form of sincerity always at last won success. Respect and affection that more and more surrounded him, and that finally made his situation sole of its kind, and preeminently happy attest, together the interesting truth, that unqualified confidence in one's errand, the serenest acceptance of a responsibility, and the exercise of a critical authority, never too apt to return critically upon itself, only require for beneficent action that they be attended at once with a fund of illustration and a fund of good humor. Professor Norton's preeminent work in the interpretation of Dante, which I mean his translation text and notes of the Divine Comedy and the New Life, an achievement of infinite piety, patience, and resource his admirable volume on church building in the Middle Ages, to say nothing of his charming earlier one study and travel in Italy largely devoted to the Cathedral of Orvieto, his long and intimate friendship with Ruskin, commemorated by his publication as joint executor to Ruskin's will of the best fruits of the latter's sustained correspondence with him, his numerous English friendships in especial, to say nothing of his native Ile, with persons of a highly representative character. These things give in part the measure of his finest curiosities, and of his appetite in all directions for the best sources and examples and the best company. But it is probable that, if his Harvard lectures are in form for publication, and if his general correspondence, and above all his own easily handsomest show, it comes to be published, as most emphatically it should be, they will testify not in the least to any unredeemed contraction of life, but to the largest and happiest and most rewarded energy, an exhilarated invocation of close responsibility, an absolute ease of mind about one's point of view, a thorough and never-failing intellectual wholeness, are so far from weakening the appeal to young allegiances that once they succeed at all they succeed the better for going all their length. So it was that with admirable urbanity of form and uncompromising straightness of attack the professor of the history of the fine arts at Harvard, for a quarter of a century, let himself go thinking no trouble wasted, and no flutter, and no scandal other than auspicious, if only he might to the receptive and aspiring undergraduate mind brand the ugly and the vulgar and the inferior, wherever he found them, tracking them through plausible disguises and into trumpery strongholds, if only he might convert young products of the unmitigated American order into material for men of the world, in the finer sense of that term, if only, in short, he might render more supple their view, liable to obfuscation from sights and sounds about them of the true meaning of a liberal education, and of the civilized character and spirit in the civilized state. What it came to thus was that he availed himself to the utmost of his free hand for sowing and planting ideal titles, that though they might after all be vague and general things, lacking sometimes a little the clearer connections with practice, were yet a new and inspiring note to most of his hearers, who could be trusted just so far as they were intelligent and loyal, not to be heavily embarrassed by them, not to want for fields of application. It was given him quite unprecedentedly to be popular, to be altogether loved and cherished, even while rubbing it into whomever, it might concern that such unfortunates were mainly given over to mediocrity and vulgarity, and that half the crude and ugly objects and aspects, half the low standards and loose ends surrounding them, and which they might take for granted with a facility and a complacency alike deplorable, represented a platitude of imagination that dishonored the citizen on whom a university worthy of the name should have left its stamp happy. It would thus in fact seem beyond any other occasion for educative influence, the immense and delightful opportunity. He enjoyed the clear field and long reach attached to preaching an aesthetic crusade to pleading for the higher amenities in general, in a new and superficially tutored, yet also but superficially prejudiced country, where a consequently felt and noted rise of the tide of manners may be held to have come home to him, or certainly to have visited his dreams. His effect on the community at large, with allowances of time, was ever indubitable, even though such workers have everywhere to take much on trust, and to remember that bushels of doctrine and even tons of example make at the most ounces and grains of responsive life. It can only be the very general and hopeful view that sustains and rewards with here and there at wide intervals the prized individual instance of the sown seed actively emerging and flowering. If not all ingenious disciples could give independent proof, however, all could rally and feel the spirit, all could crowd to a course of instruction which, largely elective and optional, yet united more listeners than many others put together, and in which the subject itself, the illustration of European artistic endeavor at large, or in other words, the record of man's most comprehensive sacrifice to organized beauty, tended so to take up on familiar ground the question of manners, character, conscience, tone, to bristle with questions addressed to the actual and possible American scene that, I hasten to add, was of course but one side of the matter. There were wells of special science for those who chose to draw from them, and an inner circle of pupils whose whole fruitful relation to their philosopher and friend, happy and easy privilege of Shady Hill in general, where other charming personal influences, helped not counting as least in Thiskin scarce, have failed to prepare much practical evidence for observations still to come. The ivory tower of study would ever, by his natural bent, I think, have most solicited Charles Norton, but he liked, as I say, he accepted without a reserve the function of presiding over young destinies. He believed in the personal and the social communication of light, and had a gift for the generous and personal relation that perhaps found its best issue, as I have already hinted, in his admirable letters. These were not of this hustled and hustling age, but of a cooler and steadier sphere and rhythm, and of a charming, mannerly, substantial type, too, which he will have been, I think, among correspondents truly animated by the social spirit, and a due cosmopolite ideal, one of the last systematically to sacrifice with the lapse of years. I ceased to be, I admit, a near spectator of his situation, but my sense of his activity with more intimate renewals, besides occasionally taking place, was to be all along so constantly fed by echo and anecdote, and all manner of indirect glimpses, that I find myself speak quite with the confidence and with all the attachment of a continuous assistant. With which, if I reflect on this, I see how interesting a case, above all my distinguished friend, was ever to remain to me. Case, I mean, of such a mixture of the elements, as would have seemed, in advance, critically speaking, quite anomalous, or at least highly incalculable. His interest was predominantly in art, as the most beneficial of human products. His ostensible plea was for the aesthetic law, under the wide wing of which we really move, it may seem to many of us, in an air of strange and treacherous appearances, of much bewilderment, and not a little mystification, of terribly fine and complicated issues, in short, such as call for the highest interpretative wisdom. But if nothing was of a more delightful example than Professor Norton's large and nourished serenity in all these connections, a serenity seasoned and tempered, as it were, by infinite interest in his subject, by a steadying faith in exact and extensive knowledge, so to a fond and incorrigible student of character, the case, as I have called it, and the long and genial career, may seem to shine in the light of quite other importances, quite other references than the presumed and the nominal. Nothing, in fact, can be more interesting to a haunter of other intellectual climes, and a worshipper at the aesthetic shrine, quond meme, than to note once more how race and implanted quality and association always in the end come by their own. How, for example, a son of the Puritans, the most intellectually transmuted, the most liberally emancipated and initiated possible, could still plead most for substance, when proposing to plead for style, could still try to lose himself in the labyrinth of delight, while keeping tight hold of the clue of duty tangled even a little in his feet, could still address himself all consistently to the moral conscience, while speaking as by his office for our imagination and our free curiosity, all of which vision of him, however, is far from pointing to a wasted effort. The great thing, whatever turn we take, is to find before us perspectives, and to have a weight to throw in accordance with which wisdom the world he lived in received for long no firmer nor more gallant and generous impress than that of Charles Eliot Norton. London Notes, January 1897. I am afraid the interest of the world of native letters is not at this moment so great as to make us despise mere translation as an aid to curiosity. There is indeed no reason why we should forbear to say in advance what we are certain every time to say after the heat has cooled. I mean, namely, that nothing is easier to concede than that Ibsen contentious name would be much less remarked. If he were one of a dozen, it is impossible, in London at least, to shut one's eyes to the fact that if to so many ingenious minds he is a kind of pictorial monster, a grotesque, on the sign of a sideshow, this is at least partly because his form has a monstrous rarity. It is one of the odd things of our actual aesthetics that the more theatres multiply, the less anyone reads a play, less anyone cares, in a word, for the text of the adventure. That no one ever does read a play has long been a commonplace of the wisdom of booksellers. Ibsen, however, is a text, and Ibsen is read, and Ibsen contradicts the custom, and confounds the prejudice with the effect thereby, in an odd way of being doubly and exotic. His violent substance imposes, as it were, his insidious form. It is not, as would have seemed more likely, the form that imposes the substance. Mr. William Archer has just published his version of John Gabriel Borkman, of which moreover French and German versions reach us at the same moment. There are therefore all the elements of a fresh breeze in the window, has already a sense as of a cracking of whips and a girding of loins. You may by this time be terribly tired of it. All in America, but as I mentioned a fortnight ago, we have had very recent evidence that languor here in this connection is by no means as yet the dominant note. It is not the dispute itself, however, that most interests me. Let me pay it for what it has been, and what it still may be, the mere superficial tribute of saying that it constitutes one of the very few cases of contagious discussion of a matter not political, a question not of mere practice, of which I remember to have felt in a heavy air the engaging titillation in London. Generally, I think the wandering breath of criticism is the stray guest at the big party. The shy young man whom nobody knows in this remarkable instance. The shy young man has ventured to pause and hover, has lighted on a topic, introduced himself, and after a gasp of consternation in the company, seen a little circle gather round him. I can only speak as one of the little circle, testifying to my individual glee. The author who, at the age of 70, a provincial of provincials, turns out John Gabriel, is frankly for me so much one of the peculiar pleasures of the day, one of the current strong sensations that erect, as he seems still to stand, I deplore his extreme maturity. Thinking of what shall happen, look round in vain for any other possible source of the same kind of emotion, for Ibsen strikes me as an extraordinary curiosity, and every time he sounds his note, the miracle to my perception is renewed. I call it a miracle because it is a result of so dry a view of life, so indifferent a vision of the comedy of things. His idea of the thing represented is never the comic idea, though this is evidently what it often only can be for many of his English readers and spectators. Comedy, moreover, is a product mainly of observation, and I scarcely know what to say of his figures, except that they haven't the signs. The answer to that is doubtless partly that they haven't the English, but have the Norwegian. In such a case, one of the Norwegian must be in truth this very lack of signs. They have no tone, but their moral tone. They are highly animated abstractions with the extraordinary, the brilliant property of becoming, when represented, at once more abstract and more living. If the spirit is a lamp within us, glowing through what the world and the flesh make of us, as through a groundless shade. Then such pictures as Little Eyolf and John Gabriel are each a chassis croisses of lamps burning, as in tasteless parlors with the flame practically exposed. There are no shades in the house, or the Norwegian groundless is singularly clear. There is a positive odor of spiritual paraffin. The author nevertheless arrives at the dramatist's great goal, arrives for all his meagerness at intensity, the meagerness which is, after all, but an unconscious and admirable economy, never interferes with that. It plays straight into the hands of his rare mastery of form. The contrast between this forms, difficult to have reached so, evolved so civilized, and the bareness and bleakness of his little northern democracy is the source of half the hard frugal charm that he puts forth in the cold fixed light of it. The notes we speak of as deficiencies take a sharp value in the picture. There is no small talk. There are scarcely any manners. On the other hand, there is so little vulgarity that this of itself has almost the effect of a deeper, a more lonely provincialism. The background, at any rate, is the sunset over the ice. Well, in the very front of the scene lunges, with extraordinary length of arm, the ego against the ego, and rocks, in a rigor of passion, the soul against the soul. A spectacle, a movement as definite as the relief of silhouettes in black paper, or of a train of Eskimo dogs on the snow. Down from that desolation, the sturdy old symbolist comes this time with a supreme example of his method. It is a high wonder and pleasure to welcome such splendid fruit from sap that might by now have shown something of the chill of age. Never has he juggled more gallantly with difficulty and danger than in this really prodigious John Gabriel, in which a great span of tragedy is taken between 3 or 4 persons, a trio of the grim and grizzled in the 2 or 3 hours of a winter's evening, in which the whole thing throbs with an actability that fairly shakes us as we read, and in which, as the very flower of his artistic triumph, he has given us, for the most beautiful and touching of his heroines, a sad old maid of 60. Such parts, even from the vulgarist point of view, are Borkman and Ella Rentheim. London Notes, June 1897. I'm afraid there are at this moment only 2 notes for a communication from London to strike. One is that of the plunge into the deep and turbid waters of the Jubilee. The other is that of the inevitable retreat from them, backward scramble up the bank and scurry over its crest and out of sight. London is in a sorry state. Nevertheless, I judge that the number of persons about to arrive undaunted will not fall substantially short of the number of horror-stricken fugitives not to depart. Is practically to arrive, for there is little difference in the 2 kinds of violence, the shock you await or the shock that awaits you. Let me hasten, however, to declare Thato speak, for the present, only of the former. Of the said prospect is full of suggestion. The affair promises a rare sort of interest. It began a fortnight since, to be clear, and the certitude grows each day that we are to be treated to a revelation really precious, the domestic or familiar vision, as it were the backstairs or underside view of a situation that will rank as celebrated. Balzac's image of l'envers de l'histoire contemporaine is in fact already under our nose, already offered us, in a big bouncing unmistakable case. We brush with an irreverent hand the back of the tapestry, crawl on unabashed knees under the tent of the circus. The commemoration of the completed 60th year of Her Majesty's reign will figure to the end of time in the roll of English wonders, and can scarcely fail to hold its own as an occasion unparalleled. And yet we touch it as we come and go, feel it mainly as a great incommodity. It has already so intimate, so ugly, so measurable a side, that these impressions begin to fall into their place, with a kind of representative force to figure, as a symbol of the general truth, that the principal pomps and circumstances of the historic page have had their most intense existence as material and social arrangements, disagreeable or amusing accidents affecting the few momentary mortals at that time in the neighborhood. The gross defacement of London, the uproarious traffic, in seats, the miles of unsightly scaffolding between the West End and the City, the screaming advertisements, the sordid struggle, the individual questions, haven't we been cheated by the plausible wretch? Or how the devil shall we get to our seats after paying such a lot? These things are actually the historic page. If we are writing that page every hour, let us at any rate commend ourselves for having begun betimes, even though this early diligence be attended with extraordinary effects. The great day was a week ago, still a month off, but what we even then had full in view was, for the coming stretch of time, a London reduced to such disfigurement as might much better seem to consort with some great national penance or mourning. The show, when the show comes off, is to last but a couple of hours, and nothing so odd surely ever occurred in such a connection as so huge. Disproportion between the discipline and the joy, if this be honor, the simple may well say, give us merciful powers the rigor of indifference, from Hyde Park Corner to the heart of the city, and over the water to the solid south. The long line of thoroughfares is masked by a forest of timber, and smothered in swaggering posters and catchpenny bids, with all of which, and with the vociferous air that enfolds them, we are to spend these next weeks in such comfort as we may the splendor will. Have of course to be great to wash down the vulgarity, and infinitely dazzling no doubt it will be, yet even if it falls short, I shall still feel that, let the quantity of shock, as I have ventured to call it, be what it must, it will on the whole be exceeded by what I have ventured to call the quantity of suggestion. This, to be frank, has even now rolled up at such a rate that to deal with it, I should scarce know where to take it first. Let me not therefore pretend to deal, but only glance and pass. The foremost, the immense impression, is of course the constant, the permanent, the aver supreme impression of that greatest glory of our race, its passionate feeling for trade. I doubt if the commercial instinct be not, as London now feels it, throb and glow quite as striking as any conceivable projection of it, that even our American pressure of the pump might at the highest produce, that is the real tent of the circus, that is the real back of the tapestry. There have long, I know, been persons ready to prove by book that the explanation of the historical event has always been somebody's desire to make money. Never, at all events from the near view, will that explanation have covered so much of the ground. No result of the fact that the Queen has reigned 60 years. No sort of sentimental or other association with it begins to have the air of coming home to the London conscience, like this happy consequence of the chance in it to sell something dear. As yet that chance is the one sound that fills the air, and will probably be the only note audibly struck, till the plaudits of the day itself begin to substitute none too soon a more mellifluous one, when the people are all at the windows and in the trees, and on the waterspouts, housetops, scaffolds, and other ledges and coigns of vantage, set as traps for them by the motive power. Then doubtless there will be another aspect to reckon with. Then we shall see of the grand occasion nothing but what is decently and presentably historic. All I mean is that, pending the apotheosis, London has found in this particular chapter of the career of its aged sovereign only an enormous selfish advertisement. It came to me the other day in a quoted epigram that the advertisement shows as far off as across the Channel, and all the way to Paris, where one of the reflections it has suggested as it must inevitably suggest many appears to be that, in contrast, when a year ago the Russian sovereigns were about to arrive, no good Parisian thought for a moment of anything but how he could most work for the adornment of his town. I dare say that in fact from a good Parisian or two a window or a tree was to be hired, but the echo is at least interesting as an echo, not less than as a reminder of how we still wait here for the outbreak of the kind of enthusiasm that shall take the decorative form, the graceful tip of its nose, has, it must be admitted, yet to show. But there are other sides still, and one of them, immense light, we may take as flooding, I mean the whole question of the solidity of the throne. It is impossible to live long in England without feeling that the monarchy is below ground, so to speak, in particular a rock, but it was reserved for these days to accentuate the immobility of even that portion of the rock which protrudes above the surface. It is being tested in a manner by fire, and it resists with a vitality nothing short of prophetic. The commercial instinct, as I say, perches upon it with a security and a success that banish a rival from the field. It is the biggest of all draws for the biggest of all circuses. It will bring more money to more doors than anything that can be imagined in its place. It will march through the ages unshaken. The coronation of a new sovereign is an event, at the worst, well within the compass of the mind. And what will that bring with it so much as a fresh lively market, and miles of new posters and new carpentry? Then who knows, coronations will for a stretch, and a change perhaps, be more frequent than anniversaries, and the bargains struck over the last will again at the worst carry an hilarious country well on to the next. Has not the monarchy, moreover, besides thus periodically making trade roar with lively merit for such an observer as I fancy, considering these things, of helping more than anything else the answers to the questions, into which our actual curiosity most overflows the question, for instance, of whether in the case before us, the triumph of vulgarity be not precisely the flushed but muscular triumph of the inevitable. If vulgarity thrones now on the housetops blown and red in the face, is it not because it has been pushed aloft by deep forces, and is really after all itself the show, the picturesque at any rate, has to meet the conditions we miss? We regret the old style of history, but the style would, I think, be there if we let it. The age has a manner of its own that disconcerts, that swamps it. The age is the loudest thing of all. What has altered is simply the conditions. Poor history has to meet them. These conditions she must accommodate herself. She must accept vulgarity or perish. Some day, doubtless, she will perish, but for a little while longer she remembers and struggles. She becomes indeed, as we look up Piccadilly in the light of this image, perhaps rather more dramatic than ever, at any rate more pathetic, more noble in her choked humiliation. Then, even as we pity her, we try perhaps to bring her round, to make her understand a little better. We try to explain that if we are dreadful to deal with, it is only really a good deal, because we so detestably grow and grow. There is so horribly much of us that's where our style breaks down. Small crowds and paltry bargains didn't matter, and a little vulgarity, just a very little, could in other times manage to pass. Our shame, alas, is our quantity. I have no sooner none the less qualified it so ungraciously than I ask myself what after all we should do without it. If we have opened the floodgates, we have at least opened them wide. And it is our very quantity that perhaps in the last resort will save us. It cuts both ways. As the phrase is, it covers all the ground. It helps the escape as well as produces the assault. If retreat, for instance, at the present juncture, is, as I began by hinting, urgently imposed, it is thanks to our having so much of everything that we find a bridge for our feet. We hope to get off in time, but meanwhile, even on the spot, there are blessed alternatives and reliefs. I have been trying a number very hard, but I have expatiated so on the complaint that I have left little room for the remedy. London reminds one of nothing so often as of the help she gives one to forget her. One of the forms actually taken by this happy habit is the ingenious little exhibition at the Grafton Galleries of so-called dramatic and musical art. The name is rather a grand one, and the show has many gaps, but it profits as such places in London so often profit by the law that makes you mostly care less what you get into than what you get out of, with its Hogarths and Zoffanists, none too many. I admit its other last-century portraits and relics, its numerous ghosts of Garrick, its old playbills, and prints, its echoes of dead plaudits, and its very thin attendance. It happens to be for the moment a quiet bower in the Beargarden. It is a scratch company, but on the end I can scarce say why. In the portion in which the portraits of the day prevail is the impression vulgar. Even there, indeed, this suspicion receives a grand lift from Mr. Whistler's exquisite image of Henry Irving as the Philip of Tennyson's Queen Mary. To pause before such a work is in fact to be held to the spot by just the highest operation of the charm. One has sought there the charm of a certain degree of melancholy meditation. Meditation, indeed, forgets Garrick and Hogarth, and all the handsome heads of the Kembles in wonder, re-intensified at the attitude of a stupid generation toward an art and a taste so rare. Wonder is perhaps, after all, not the word to use, for how should a stupid generation, liking so much that it does like, and with a faculty trained to coarser motions, recognize in Mr. Whistler's work one of the finest of all distillations of the artistic intelligence, to turn from his picture to the rest of the show, which, of course, I admit, is not a collection of masterpieces, to drop from the world of distinction, of perception, of beauty and mystery and perpetuity, into a very ordinary place. And yet the effect of Whistler at his best is exactly to give to the place he hangs in, or perhaps I should say to the person he hangs for, something of the sense of the illusion of a great museum. He isolates himself in a manner all his own. His presence is in itself a sort of implication of a choice corner. Have we in this a faint foresight of the eventual turn of the wheel-off, one of the nooks of honor, those innermost rooms of great collections in which our posterity shall find him, look at him at any rate on any occasion, but above all at his best, only long enough, and hallucination sets in. We are in the presence of one of the prizes marked with 2 stars in the guidebook. The polished floor is beneath us, and the rococo roof above the great names are ranged about, and the eye is aware of the near window in its deep recess that overhangs old gardens or a celebrated square. London Notes, July 1897. I continued last month to seek private diversion, which I found to be more and more required. As the machinery of public began to work, never was a better chance, apparently, for the great anodyne of art. It was a supreme opportunity to test the spell of the magician, for one felt one was saved. If a fictive world would open, I knocked in this way at a dozen doors. I read a succession of novels with the effect perhaps of feeling more than ever before my individual liability in our great general debt to the novelists. The great thing to say for them is surely that at any given moment they offer us another world, another consciousness, an experience that as effective as the dentist's ether muffles the ache of the actual, and by helping us to an interval tides us over and makes us face in the return to the inevitable a combination that may at least have changed what we get, of course, in proportion as the picture lives, is simply another actual of other people. And I no more than anyone else pretend to say why that should be a relief as great, I mean, as it practically proves we meet in this question. I think the eternal mystery that sends us back simply to the queer constitution of man, and that is not in the least lighted by the plea of romance, the argument that relief depends wholly upon the quantity, as it were, of fable. It depends to my sense on the quantity of nothing, but art in which the material fable or fact, or whatever it be, falls so into solution, is so reduced and transmuted, that I absolutely am acquainted with no receipt whatever for computing its proportion and amount. The only amount I can compute is the force of the author, for that is directly registered in my attention, my submission. 100 things naturally go to make it up. But he knows so much better than I what they are that I should blush to give him a glimpse of my inferior account of them. The anodyne is not the particular picture, it is our own act of surrender, and therefore most for each reader what he most surrenders to this latter element would seem in turn to vary from case to case, were it not indeed that there are readers prepared, I believe, to limit their surrender in advance with some. We gather it declines, for instance, to operate save on an exhibition of high life. In others again, it is proof against any solicitation, but that of low in many, it vibrates only to adventure in many, only to Charlotte Brontë in various groups, according to affinity, only to Jane Austen, to old Dumas, to Miss Corelli, to Dostoevsky, or whomever it may be. The readers easiest to conceive, however, are probably those for whom in the whole impression the note of sincerity in the artist is what most matters, what most reaches and touches. That obviously is the relation that gives the widest range to the anodyne. I am afraid that, profiting by my license, I drag forward Mr. George Gissing from an antiquity of several weeks. I blow the dust of oblivion from Roman 1000 Pier Lodi, and indeed from all the companythy have been published for days and days. I foresee, however, that I must neglect the company for the sake of the two members I have named right as I speak, for myself always in order, though not, I admit, on quite the same line. Mr. Gissing would have been particularly in order had he only kept for the present period the work preceding his latest, all the more that in the year of Jubilee has, to my perception, some points of superiority to the whirlpool. For this author in general, at any rate, I profess, and have professed ever since reading the new Grub Street, a persistent, tasty taste that triumphs even over the fact that he almost as persistently disappoints me. I fail as yet to make out why exactly it is that, going so far, he so sturdily refuses to go further. The whole business of distribution and composition he strikes me as having cast to the winds. But just this fact of a question about him is a part of the wonder. I use the word in the sense of enjoyment that he excites. It is not every day in the year that we meet a novelist about whom there is a question. The circumstance alone is almost sufficient to beguile or to enthrall. And I seem to myself to have said almost everything in speaking of something that Mr. Gissing goes far enough to do. To go far enough to do anything is, in the conditions we live in, a lively achievement. The whirlpool, I crudely confess, was in a manner a grief to me, but the book has much substance, and there is no light privilege in an emotion so sustained. This emotion, perhaps it is that most makes me to the end stick to Mr. Gissing, makes me, with an almost nervous clutch, quite cling to him. I shall not know how to deal with him, however, if I withhold the last outrage of calling him an interesting case. he seems to me above all a case of saturation. And it is mainly his saturation that makes him interesting. I mean especially in the sense of making him singular. The interest would be greater were his art more complete, but we must take what we can get. And Mr. Gissing has a way of his own. The great thing is that his saturation is with elements that presented to us in contemporary English fiction affect us as a product of extraordinary oddity and rarity. He reeks with the savor he is bowed beneath the fruits of contact with the lowest middle class, and that is sufficient to make him an authority in facton, a region vast and unexplored. The English novel has as a general thing kept so desperately, so nervously clear of it, whisking back compromised skirts and bumping frantically against obstacles to retreat, that we welcome as the boldest of adventurers a painter who has faced it and survived. We have had low life in plenty, for with its sores and vices, its crimes and penalties, misery has color enough to open the door to any quantity of artistic patronage. We have shuddered in the dens of thieves and the cells of murderers, and have dropped the inevitable tear over tortured childhood and purified sin. We have popped in at the damp cottage with my lady, and heard the quaint rustic bless his simple heart, commit himself for our amusement. We have fraternized, on the other hand, with the peerage and the county families, staying at fine old houses till exhausted nature has for this source of intoxication not a wink of sociability left. It has grown, the source in question, as stale as the sweet biscuit with pink enhancements in that familiar jar of the refreshment counter, from which even the attendant young lady in black, with admirers and a social position, hesitates to extract it. We have recognized the humble, the wretched, even the wicked. Also we have recognized the smart. But save under the immense pressure of Dickens, we have never done anything so dreadful as to recognize the vulgar. We have, at the very most, recognized it as the extravagant, the grotesque. The case of Dickens was absolutely special. He dealt intensely with lowest middle elements. But he escaped the predicament of showing them as vulgar by showing them only as prodigiously droll. When his people are not funny, who shall dare to say what they are? The critic may draw breath as from a responsibility averted when he reflects that they almost always are funny. They belong to a walk of life that we may be ridiculous, but never at all serious about. We may be tragic, but that is often but a form of humor. I seem to hear Mr. Gissing say, well, dreariness for dreariness, let us try Bronsbury and Pinner, especially as in the first place I know them so well, as in the second they are the essence of England, and as in the third they are, artistically speaking, virgin soil. Behold them glitter in the morning dew. So he is seriousal most imperturbably about them, and as it turns out, even quite manfully and admirably sad. He has the great thing, his saturation with the visible and audible common can project itself. Let him get outside of it and walk round it. I scarcely think he stays, as it were, outside quite as much as he might. And on the question of form, he certainly strikes me as staying far too little at his form above all that is talent. And if Mr. Gissing's were proportionate to his knowledge, to what may be called his possession, we should have a larger force to reckon with. That not to speak of the lack of intensity in his imagination is the direction in which one would wish him to go further. Our Anglo-Saxon tradition of these matters remains surely in some respects strangest. After the perusal of such a book as The Whirlpool, I feel as if I had almost to explain that by these matters I mean the whole question of composition, of foreshortening, of the proportion and relation of parts. Mr. Gissing, to wind up my reserves, overdoes the ostensible report of spoken words, though I hasten to add that this abuse is so general a sign in these days of the English and the American novel as to deprive a challenge of every hope of credit. It is attended visibly to those who can see with 2 or 3 woeful results. If it had none other, it would still deserve arraignment on the simple ground of what it crowds out: the golden blocks themselves of the structure, the whole divine exercise and mystery of the exquisite art of presentation. The ugliest trick it plays, at any rate, is its effect on that side of the novelist's effortless side of most difficulty and thereby of most dignity, which consists in giving the sense of duration, of the lapse and accumulation of time. This is altogether, to my view, the stiffest problem that the artist in fiction has to tackle, and nothing is more striking at present than the blankness. For the most part of his indifference to it, the mere multiplication of quoted remarks is the last thing to strengthen his hand. Such an expedient works exactly to the opposite end, absolutely minimizing in regard to time our impression of lapse and passage. That is so much the case that I can think of no novel in which it prevails as giving at all the sense of the gradual and the retarded stretch of the years in which developments really take place. The picture is nothing unless it be a picture of the conditions, and the conditions are usually hereby quite omitted. Thanks to this perversity, everything dealt with in fiction appears at present to occur simply on the occasion of a few conversations about it. There is no other constitution of it. A few hours, a few days seem to account for it. The process, the dark backward and abysm, is really so little reproduced. We feel tempted to send many an author to learn the rudiments of this secret back to his Balzac. Again, the most accomplished master of it, he will learn also from Balzac, while he is about it, that nothing furthermore as intrinsic effect so much discounts itself as this abuse of the element of colloquy. Dialogue, as it is commonly called, is singularly suicidal from the moment it is not directly illustrative of something given us by another method, something constituted and presented. It is impossible to read work even as interesting as Mr. Gissing's without recognizing the impossibility of making people both talk all the time and talk with the needful differences. The thing, so far as we have got, is simply too hard. There is always at the best the author's voice to be kept out. It can be kept out for occasions. It cannot be kept out always. The solution, therefore, is to leave it its function, for it has the supreme one. This function, properly exercised, averts the disaster of the blight of the colloquy. Really, in place illustrative and indispensable, nothing is more inevitable than such a blight when antecedently the general effect of the process has been undermined. We then want the report of the spoken word, want that only, but proportionately it doesn't come, doesn't count. It has been fatally cheapened. There is no effect, no relief. I am writing a treatise when I meant only to give a glance, and it may be asked if the best thing I find in Mr. Gissing is after all then but an opportunity to denounce. The answer to that is that I find two other thinkers should find them. Rather, had I not deprived myself, as usual, of proper space. One of these is the pretext for speaking by absolute rebound, as it were, and in the interest of vivid contrast of Pierre Lodi. The other is a better occasion, still an occasion for the liveliest sympathy. It is impossible not to be affected by the frankness and straightness of Mr. Gissing's feeling for his subject, a subject almost always distinctly remunerative to the ironic, and even to the dramatic mind. He has the strongest, deepest sense of common humanity, of the general struggle, and the general gray, grim comedy. He loves the real, he renders it, and though he has a tendency to drift too much with his tide, he gives us in the great welter of the savorless and individual manly strain. If he only had distinction, he would make the suburbs hum. I don't mean, of course, by his circulation. They're the effect Ibsen is supposed to have on them. I mean objectively, and as a rounded whole, as a great theme treated. I am ashamed of having postponed Ramuncio, for Ramuncio is a direct recall of the beauty of Pecheur Island, and Mon Frere Ives, in other words, a literary impression of the most exquisite order. Perhaps, indeed, it is as well that a critic should postpone quite indefinitely an author, as to whom he is ready to confess that his critical instinct is quite suspended. Oh, the blessing of a book, the luxury of a talent that one is only anxious not to reason about, only anxious to turn over in the mind. And to taste it is a poor business perhaps, but I have nothing more responsible to say of Lodi than that I adore him, I love him, when he is baddened. Heaven knows he has occasionally been far more than I love other writers when they are good. If therefore he is on the whole quite at his best in Ramuncio, I fear my appreciation is an undertaking too merely active for indirect expression. I can give it no more coherent form than to say that he makes the act of partaking one of the joys that, as things mainly go, a reader must be pretty well provided to be able not to jump at, and yet there are readers apparently who are so provided. There are readers who don't jump, and are cocksure they can do without it. My sense of the situation is that they are wrong, that with famine stalking so abroad literally, no one can, I defy it, not to tell somewhere Beckham, a gap one can immediately spot. It is well to content oneself at all events with affection, so stiff a job in such a case is understanding, or still more explanation. There is a kind of finality in Lodi's simplicity, if it even be simplicity he performs in an air in which on the part of the spectator analysis withers, and only submission lives. Has it anything to do with literature? Has it anything to do with nature? It must be, we should suppose, the last refinement either of one or of the other. Is it all emotion? Is it all calculation? Is it all truth? Is it all humbug? All we can say as readers is that it is for ourselves all experience, and of the most personal intensity. The great question is, whether it be emotion neat or emotion rendered and reduced. If it be resolved into art, why hasn't it more of the chill? If it be sensibility pure, why isn't it cruder and clumsier? What is exquisite is the contact of sensibility made somehow so convenient with only the beauty preserved. It is not too much to say of Lodi that his sensibility begins where that of most of those who use the article ends, if moreover in effect he represents the triumph of instinct, when was instinct ever so sustained and so unerring it keeps him unfailingly in the matter of dialogue out of the overflow and the waste. It is a joy to see how his looseness is pervaded, after all, by proportion. London Notes, August 1897. I shrink at this day from any air of relapsing into reference to those Victorian Saturnalia, of which the force may now be taken as pretty well spent. And if I remount the stream for an instant, it is but with the innocent intention of plucking the one little flower of literature, that while the current roared happened so far at least as I could observito sprout by the bank, if it was sole of its kind moreover, it was, I hasten to add, a mere accident of the Jubilee, and as little a prominent as a preconcerted feature. What it comes to, therefore, is that if I gathered at the supreme moment a literary impression, the literary impression had yet nothing to do with the affair, nothing that is beyond the casual connection given by a somewhat acrid aftertaste, the vision of the London of the morrow. As I met this experience in a woeful squeeze through town the day after the fair, it was the singular fate of Roman 1000 Burget, invited to lecture at Oxford under university patronage, and with Gustave Flaubert for his subject, to have found his appearance arranged for June 23. I express this untowardness, but feebly I know, for those at a distance from the edge of the whirlpool, the vast concentric eddies that suck down all other life. I found on the morrow in question, the great day, had been the 22nd main suggestion of a journey from the south of England up to Waterloo, and across from Waterloo to Paddington, to be that of one of those deep gasps or wild staggers, losses of wind and of balance, that follow some tremendous effort or some violent concussion. The weather was splendid and torrid, and London, a huge dusty cable's confusion of timber, already tottering of decorations, already stale of badauds, already bored the banquet hall, was by no means deserted, but it was choked with mere echoes and canlines. One had heard often enough of a great national awakening, and this was the greatest it would have been possible to imagine. Millions of eyes opening to dust and glare from the scenery of dreams seemed slowly to stare, and to try to recollect. Certainly at that distance, the omens were poor for such concentration as a French critic might have been moved to count upon. And even on reaching Oxford, I was met by the sense that the spirit of that seat of learning, though accustomed to intellectual strain, had before the afternoon but little of a margin for pulling itself together. Let me say at once that it made the most of the scant interval, and that when 5 o'clock came, the bare scholastic room at the Taylorian offered Roman 1000 Burget's reputation and topic in the hot, dead Oxford air an attention as deep and as many-headed as the combination could ever have hoped to command. For one auditor, of whom I can speak at all events, the occasion had an intensity of interest transcending even that of Flaubert's strange personal story, which was part of Roman 1000 Burget's theming of the new and deep meanings that the lecturer read into it. Just the fact of the occasion itself struck me as having well-nigh most to say, and at any rate fed most the all but bottomless sense that constitutes today my chief receptacle of impressions, a sense which at the same time I fear I cannot better describe than as that of the way we are markedly going, no undue eagerness to determine whether this be well or ill attaches to the particular consciousness I speak of, and I can only give it frankly for what on the whole it most for beguilement, for amusement, for the sweet thrill of perception represents, and achieves, quickened notation of our modernity. I feel that I can pay this last-named lively influence no greater tribute than by candidly accepting as an aid to expression its convenient name. To do that, doubtless, is to accept with the name a host of other things. From the moment, at any rate, the quickening I speak of sets, in it is wonderful how many of these other things play by every circumstance into the picture. That the day should have come for Roman 1000 Birgit to lecture at Oxford, and should have come by the same stroke for Gustave Flaubert to be lectured about, filled the mind to a degree, and left it in an agitation of violence, which almost excluded the question of what in especial one of these spirits was to give, and the other to gain. It was enough of an emotion for the occasion to live, in the circumstance that the author of Madame Bovary could receive in England a public baptism of such peculiar solemnity, with the vision of that one could bring in all the light and color of all the rest of the picture, and absolutely see for the instant something momentous in the very act of happening, something certainly that might easily become momentous with a little interpretation. Such are the happy chances of the critical spirit, always yearning to interpret, but not always in presence of the right mystery. There was a degree of poetic justice, or at least of poetic generosity, in the introduction of Flaubert to a scene, to conditions of credit and honor so little to have been by himself ever apprehended or estimated. It was impossible not to feel that no setting or stage for the crowning of his bust could less have appeared familiar to him, and that he wouldn't have failed to wonder into what strangely alien air his glory had strayed. So it is that, as I say, the whole affair was a little miracle of our breathless pace, and no corner from which another member of the craft could watch. It was so quiet as to attenuate the small magnificence of the hour. No novelist, in a word worth his salt, could fail of a consciousness, under the impression of his becoming rather more of a novelist than before. Was it not, on the whole, just the essence of the matter that had for the moment there its official recognition? Were not the blessed mystery and art ushered forward in a more expectant and consecrating hush than had ever yet been known to wait upon them? One may perhaps take these things too hard and read into them foolish fancies, but the hush in question was filled to my imagination quite apart from the listening faces, of which there would be special things to say that I wouldn't for the world risk with the great picture of all the old grey quads and old green gardens, of all the so totally different traditions and processions that were content at last, if only for the drowsy end of a summer afternoon, to range themselves round and play at hospitality. What it appeared possible to make out was a certain faint convergence. That was the idea of which during the whole process I felt the agreeable obsession from the moment it brushed the mind. Certainly, the impulse was to clutch and detain it. Too doleful would it have been to entertain for an instant the fear that Roman 1000 Birgit's lecture could leave the two elements of his case facing each other only at the same distance at which it had found them. No, there was nothing for it but to assume and insist that with each tick of the clock they moved a little nearer together. That was the process, as I have called it, and none the less interesting to the observer that it may not have been, and may not yet be, rapid, full, complete, quite easy, or clear, or successful. It was the seed of contact that assuredly was sown. It was the friendly beginning that in a manner was made. The situation was handled, and modified. The day was a date I shall perhaps remain obscure, unless I say more expressly and literally that the particular thing into which, for the perfect outsider, the occasion most worked was a lively interest, far as an outsider could feel it, in the whole odd phenomenon and spectacle of a certain usual positive want of convergence, want of communication between what the seat and habit of the classics, the famous frequentation and discipline, do for their victims in one direction, and what they do not do for them in another. Was the invitation to Roman 1000 Birgit not a dim symptom of bridging of this queerest of all chasms I can only so denominate as a most anomalous gap, the class of possibilities to which we owe its so often coming over us in England, that the light kindled by the immense academic privilege is apt suddenly to turn to thick smoke in the air of contemporary letters. There are movements of the classic torch, round modern object, strange drips and drops, and wondrous waverings that have the effect of putting it straight out the range of reference that I allude to, and that is most the fashion draws its credit from being an education of the taste, and it doubtless makes on the prescribed lines, and in the close company of the ancients' tremendous tests and triumphs for that principle. Nothing, however, is so singular as to see what again and again becomes of it in the presence of examples for which prescription and association are of no avail. I am speaking here, of course, not of unexpected reserves, but of unexpected raptures, bewildering revelations, of a failure of the sense of perspective. This leads at times to queer conjunctions, strange collocations in which Euripides gives an arm to Sarah Grand, an octave fulet harks back to Virgil. It is the breath of a madness in which one gropes for a method, probes in vain the hiatus, and sighs for the missing link. I am far from meaning to say that all this will find itself amended by the discreet dose administered the other day at the Taylorian of even so great an antidote as Flaubert. But I come back to my theory that there is after all hope for a world still so accessible to salutary shocks. That was apparent indeed some years ago. Was it not at the Taylorian that Taine and Renan successively lectured Oxford, wherever it was heard them, even then to the end? It is for the Taines, Renans, and Burgit's very much the salting of the tail of the bird. There must be more than one try. It is possible to have glanced at some of the odd estimates that the conversation of the cultivated throws to the surface, and yet to say quite without reserve that the world of books has suffered no small shrinkage by the recent death of Mrs. Oliphant. She had long lived and worked in it, and from no individual perhaps had the great contemporary flood received a more copious tribute. I know not if some study of her remarkable life, and still more of her remarkable character, be in preparation, but she was a figure that would on many sides still lend itself to vivid portraiture. Her success had been in its day as great as her activity, yet it was always present to me that her singular gift was less recognized, or at any rate less reflected, less reported upon than it deserved, unless, indeed, she may have been one of those difficult cases for criticism, an energy of which the spirit and the form straggling apart never join hands with that effective union, which in literature more than anywhere else is strength. Criticism among us all has come to the pass of being shy of difficult cases, and no one for that matter practiced it more in the hit-or-miss fashion, and on happy-go-lucky lines than Mrs. Oliphant herself. She practiced it, as she practiced everything, on such an inordinate scale that her biographer, if there is to be one, will have no small task in the mere drafting of lists of her contributions to magazines and journals in general, and to Blackwood in particular. She wrought in Blackwood for years anonymously, and profusely. No writer of the day found a portive one nearer to hand, or used it with an easier personal latitude and comfort. I should almost suppose, in fact, that no woman had ever for half a century had her personal say so publicly and irresponsibly. Her facilities, of course, were of her own making, but the wonder was that once made they could be so applied. The explanation of her extraordinary fecundity was a rare original equipment, an imperturbability of courage, health, and brain, to which was added the fortune or the merit of her having had to tune her instrument at the earliest age. That instrument was essentially a Scotch one. Her stream flowed long and full, without losing its primary color. To say that she was organized highly for literature would be to make too light of too many hazards and conditions, but few writers of our time have been so organized for liberal foreign, may almost put heroic production. One of the interesting things in big persons is that they leave us plenty of questions, if only about themselves, and precisely one of those that Mrs. Oliphant suggests is the wonder and mystery of a love of letters that could be so great without ever on a single occasion even being greater. It was of course not a matter of mere love. It was a part of her volume and abundance that she understood life itself in a fine free-handed manner, and I imagine seldom refused to risk a push at a subject, however it might have given pause that would help to turn her wide wheel. She worked largely from obligation to meet the necessities and charges and pleasures and sorrows of which she had a plentiful share. She showed in it all a sort of sedentary dash and acceptance of the day's task, and an abstention from the plaintive note, from which I confess I could never withhold my admiration. Her capacity for labor was infinite labor of the only sort that with the fine strain of old Scotch pride and belated letterless Toryism that was in her, she regarded as respectable. She had small patience with newfangled attitudes, or with a finical conscience. What was good enough for Sir Walter was good enough for her, and I make no doubt that. Her shrewd, unfiltered, easy flow, fed after all by an immensity of reading, as well as of observation and humor, would have been good enough for Sir Walter. If this had been the case, with her abounding history, biography, and criticism, it would have been still more the case, with her uncontrolled flood of fiction. She was really a great improvisatrice, a night-working spinner of long, loose, vivid yarns, numberless, pauseless, admirable, repeatedly, for their full, pleasant, reckless rustle over depths, and difficultous, admirable, indeed, in any case of Scotch elements, for many a close engagement with these, she showed in no literary relation more acuteness than in the relation so profitable a one as it has always been. The inexhaustible little country, which has given so much yet has ever so much more to give, and all the romance and reality of which she had at the end of her pen, her Scotch folk have a wealth of life, and I think no Scotch talk in fiction less of a strain to the patience of the profane. It may be less austerely veracious than some, but these are esoteric matters. Reading since her death Kirstinan of the Hundred, but published in her latest period, and much admired by some judges, I was, though beguiled, not too much beguiled to be struck afresh with that elusive fact on which I just touched, the mixture in the whole thing. Such a product as Kirstine has life eyes full of life, but the critic is infinitely baffled. It may, of course, be said to him that he has nothing to do with compositions of this order with such wares altogether as Mrs. Oliphant dealt in, but he can accept that retort only with a renunciation of some of his liveliest anxieties. Let him take some early day for getting behind, as it were the complexion of a talent that could care to handle a thing to the tune of so many pages, and yet not care more to do it. There is a fascination in the mere spectacle of so serene an instinct for the middle way, so visible a conviction that to reflect is to be lost. Mrs. Oliphant was never lost, but she too often saved herself at the expense of her subject. I have no space to insist, but so much of the essence of the situation in Kirstine strikes me as mist dropped out without a thought, that the wonder is all the greater of the fact that in spite of it, the book does in a manner scramble over its course, and throw up a fresh strong air. This was certainly the most that the author would have pretended, and from her scorn of precautions springs a gleam of impertinence quite in place in her sharp and handsome physiognomy, that of a person whose eggs are not all in one basket, nor all her imagination in service at once. There is scant enough question of art in the matter, but there is a friendly way for us to feel about so much cleverness, courage, and humanity. We meet the case in wishing that the timid talents were a little more like her, and the bold ones a little less.